praising God again, this time for giving us a purpose. Let's call this chapter, therefore, too thin, because one of the greatest dangers to us fulfilling our purpose is being spread too thin in life. As it seems, Judah or Israel is being spread too thin here in this chapter, chapter 17, where he gives us a parable or maybe another allegory of a vine and two eagles. In the first 6 verses, describing a riddle of one eagle, one that's magnificent, I guess. It's impressive. We'll later on find out that it's Babylon, but it's going to talk about the way that that eagle breaks off the top of a cedar and plants it in another land, a land in which that cedar and its seeds actually thrive. However, the seeds, as they've begun to thrive in verses 7 through 8, decide to lean toward another eagle. And it all seems, or at least to me, seemed confusing until he poses the question in verse 9, really verses 9 and 10. A question is really going to make it more confusing until it gets clear. Will that branch thrive? The one that is now spread between two eagles. One, the one under which it thrived, and the other, it now seems to be more interested or more inclined toward. Verse 11 helps us to understand, as God says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, say now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean?" I can't blame him because I didn't either, until he gives the explanation going on through verse 15, making it clear that this is an allegory or a parable of the way that they were taken off, or the first round of exiles was taken off into Babylonian captivity, leaving a covenant with the remaining king, presumably Zedekiah, back in Judah. An agreement that as long as he was able to serve or willing to serve the king of Babylon, they got to stay and rule their own land from their own place. However, they got super interested in finding help from Egypt to liberate themselves from Babylonian partial captivity or authority. And that is the point at which God says you messed up. Because as we talked about recently, they weren't simply making a covenant with the king of Babylon. They were actually making a covenant with God, represented by the king of Babylon. And in breaking the covenant, they have brought on themselves a whole new set of problems, which he is going to describe in verses 16 through 21, saying that the king of Babylon is now going to, let me state it in the reverse order. The king of Judah, once again, presumably Zedekiah, is now going to be shipped off to Babylon, as we have heard before, where he will eventually die, never to see his homeland, Judah, the one he was trying to liberate again. Even worse, verse 21 lets us know he is going to get, in at least the ESV translation, a whole host of his choice troops killed in the process. Going on to the end of the chapter from verses 22 through 24, God is going to conclude by saying he himself will take a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar and he will set it out and it will thrive to fulfill its purpose. What he will describe in verses 23 on, when he says, "On the mountain height of Israel will I plant it, that it may bear branches and produce fruit and become a noble cedar. And under it will dwell every kind of bird. In the shade of its branches, birds of every sort will rest." As verse 24 concludes, "And all the trees of the field shall know that I am the Lord. I bring low the high tree and I make high the low tree. Dry up the green tree and make the dry tree flourish. I am the Lord. I have spoken. I will do it." The thing that most caught my attention, quite possibly being our title. The fact that they got spread too thin between two desires, dissatisfied for the plan for their restoration that God had for them under Babylonian rule, they sought to break out and pursue their own independence in league or in a partnership with Egypt. A covenant deal or a partnership that would fail because, as we saw all the way back in Isaiah 30 and 31, it was a deal that did not have God's approval. Understanding that, even worse, it seems that a lot of their choice soldiers might have gotten killed or been lost in the exchange. Understanding that it's literally going to say in verse 21, "and the pick of his troops." Some translations simply say the fugitives, or what does it actually say? Yeah, the fugitives are lost. But understanding the history of Israel, the decline of their mighty men over the years, as we mentioned recently, of needless battles being spread too thin in directions God had not called them to go. It fits with the history that they are over time losing valuable troops or valuable resources to being spread, once again, too thin. And finally, being spread too thin seemed to compromise their ability to focus on and develop under their purpose, as this chapter concludes, to be shelter for every kind of bird, in the shade of whose branches every sort of bird would nest. Reminding me so much of the revelation, God pointing to his shelter and what he has designed for himself and for all of us. When in chapter 7, roundabout verse 9, the famous passage reads, and after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hand, and crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Reminding me so much of what we have back here in Ezekiel, reminding us that God's purpose for his people isn't all that different from the purpose he has set forth in the Revelation, where it promises that he is making all things new. And as I've heard some teachers teach the beginning of all things in the Genesis, starting out as good and very good, they never max out at perfect. At the end of the Revelation, we are seeing something that looks a whole lot closer to perfection. And understanding that sometimes, even though many things that God tells us are mysterious, sometimes we lose the simple things in being spread too thin. Understanding that by the time we get to chapter 19, we will see another allegory or parable of two lions, or a lioness with two lion cubs that grow to be full adult lions. And in their pursuit of prey, they end up toppling and stumbling and being carried off into various forms of captivity. Understanding that those two lions seem to represent the way that God's people have, over different times or points in their history, fallen in pursuit of their own ambitions. Chapter 17 may be helping us understand how God's people can only thrive once they reject the temptation to be spread too thin and get back to simply fulfilling their purpose.